Before I begin my remarks, I must say to Kirsten Duncan, your deeply felt words moved us all. It showed us what courage you have and what resolve you have to live life to the fullest. And I think this group here wishes you well on your journey. And I am deeply grateful to the CSPC for honoring me with this award. It's so meaningful, so very special. I really am truly humbled. In accepting this award, I do so fully aware that so many colleagues, co-workers, students, government officials, ministers provided invaluable advice and support at different times throughout my career. And my heartfelt gratitude is extended to them all. Tonight, two perspectives inform my reflections. The first, and I've characterized it as two bookends. The first, it was penned by Tennyson, who had Ulysses say, "I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is like an arch, through which gleams that untraveled world, whose margins fade forever and forever," a bit like a kaleidoscope with each movement. And that was a constantly changing world that I traveled, beginning with the time when I graduated from medicine in 1958, a 65-year journey on uncharted vistas. And the second perspective is that of the wise philosopher Kierkegaard, who noted that life can really only be understood backwards, but truly is lived forwards. And tonight I want to look backwards somewhat, but tell you that the life forward is going to be even more exciting. And I look backwards, I recognize that key pivotal moments, life-changing experiences, altered that ever-changing landscape. And in the first phase of my talk, I want to talk about my untraveled world that began in endocrinology, a chosen field. I had imagined when I entered medicine I might be a family doctor, much in need today, but there is still need for endocrinologists as well. I moved to Boston to engage in my initial studies. It was a simpler world, simpler time. Imagine, not a single hormone could be measured in blood at that time. Clinical diagnosis depended on careful observation and deductive reasoning, but it was in early, mid-1950s that Burson and Yallow at the Bronx VA hospital developed a new technique, a radioimmunoassay that allowed the measurement of small amounts of hormones in small blood samples, and that forever changed the landscape of endocrinology. And I was part of that early excitement. We learned about new hormones. In the lab that I trained, growth hormone, human growth hormone, had just been shown to actually be effective in stimulating growth in children who were short. And so when I moved to McGill to take up my first faculty position, I continued my studies on the pituitary and had the great joy and good fortune to discover the hormone human prolactin, a hormone that the experts thought doesn't exist. It's not possible, but it really was. It was there. And with the development of a radioimmunoassay, we very quickly defined the change in the role of prolactin in health and disease. Discovered that in these samples, that many of which were sent from all over the world, that we could define the small changes. If the normal level in women, men is in the neighborhood of 20, we saw these levels in some women at 100, 300, 1,000, 10,000, and inevitably when the prolactin levels rose, the women were infertile. In fact, 20% of women who were infertile had elevated levels of prolactin. And as good luck would have it, surprisingly, almost at the same time, we, working with a pharmaceutical company, discovered that a dopamine agonist would shut off this excess secretion. Prolactin levels would return to normal, and the woman's cycle would begin, and if pregnancy was desired, would inevitably occur within 6 months. An example of the collaborative effort that took place was when I was called over to my office one day to be introduced to 5 Alitalia flight attendants who came over with 300 or 400 samples of blood carefully collected by Professor Carenz at Rome University with a request letter, would I please measure prolactin in these samples, and which we were able to do in short order. And from that emerged a friendship and a collaboration that lasted many, many decades. And immediately we were able to define the prolactin changes that occur during pregnancy. And so the fog and mystery of the untraveled world of prolactin came into focus. What was previously terra incognito was now translated into the scientific basis of clinical practice. And I'm pleased to say that 50 years later, more or less, the guidelines that we wrote way back then still operate today. Unfortunately, time doesn't permit me to chronicle all the many rewarding experiences I encountered and enjoyed at the University of Manitoba while I was there some 20 years. With perhaps one exception, I had a small advisory role to play in the siting of the high-level containment facility, the National Microbiology Laboratory, which had been decided should be located in Winnipeg. And I could see across from my office this asphalt mixing plant, the city mixing plant. I drove by one day and with my fellow commissioners who had been asked by the Honorable Jake Epp to give him advice on the site, we readily agreed this would be ideal because it was in juxtaposition to the Health Sciences Center. And the mayor, upon meeting with us, received our advice because we had advised him it would be the right thing to do for the city to donate the land to the federal government. Doesn't happen often that way. But he did, and that's the site of the National Microbiology Lab, which was the first to, with Mark O'Mara in BC, decode the first SARS virus, and the first Ebola vaccine, which actually was flown to Liberia and given at the last minute at death's doorstep to a doctor, and you may have seen his picture on the national news in the U.S. within hours of receiving the ESMAD vaccine, the antibodies. He recovered fully and was able to fly back and walk when he got off the airplane. Amazing story. First important step. I move now to my discussion on my role in helping facilitate the creation of CIHR. It really began when I was appointed in 1991 as president of the Medical Research Council. And the first major step I undertook was to engage in a national consultation, the strategic planning process, which ultimately yielded a strategic plan carefully written with elegant prose by the late Professor Michael Bliss. And the first priority identified in this plan was the MRC will embrace the full spectrum of health research, an early harbinger of the changes to come in the untraveled world leading to CIHR. And so we were beginning to implement some of the projected changes and plans when there was election held in '93 and the Chrétien government gained a majority. And soon after taking office, recognizing the desperate financial situation of Canada, Minister of Finance said, we're going to attack this deficit come hell or high water. And major reductions of all programs across government were imposed, including of the 3 granting councils over a three-year period. This was a very difficult adjustment for all of us. But finally in '97, there was a promising signal that the belt-tightening phase perhaps was over, with an investment of $800 million in the newly created entity called Canada Foundation for Innovation. I was part of that deliberative group that outlined some of its programs, but the final budget reductions in the third year were still in place, and we were really facing a decision by the council whether to cancel whole programs that were supporting young people. It was a desperate time. I felt that it was important for me to try and speak to Mr. Martin directly to advise him of the serious effects the budget reductions had on health and medical research in Canada. It was a crisis. How would I reach Mr. Martin? It turned out that sometimes you know certain people, and the one person I knew was Dr. David Mulder, who you may have seen in the news just in the last week or two is retired now as the physician to the Montreal Canadiens. And he was able to contact Mr. Martin and arrange for a group of us to go and see him on a snowy Saturday afternoon in his apartment in Montreal. We arrived. We could hear we could see that he was Mr. Martin was in the process of picking up china. He just met with a delegation, and as he carried the cups, saucers, could hear the crashing of some china. And Mrs. Martin said, "Paul, that's not my favorite set, is it?" And he said, "I'm afraid so, dear." So when he came back, he was not in the best of moods. And started off by simply saying, "Doctor, you're not here to ask for more money, are you?" And I said, "Sir, I'm here in the national interest. I think it's important for you to know the harm that is taking place, the concerns that we have, and the council will have to cancel whole programs. And I really did want you to know that firsthand." And after a bit of back and forth, he said, "Well, you send me a 1 or 2 pager in the next 48 hours, and I'll have a look at it." But the coordinated effort by the research community continued. So early in mid-January, ahead of the budget, I got a call from Mr. Martin. Say, "Doctor, would you please call off your troops? I can't go through a bathroom or an airport without somebody buttonholing me and asking me to give more money for medical research." And I said, "Well, I can only apologize for any inconvenience, Minister, but I know our community is passionate, and I know you are too." And in the 1998 budget speech, Mr. Martin announced the cancellation of all the cuts to all the councils. And it was in that exact period, it seemed to me I'd been thinking a great deal about the difficulties faced by the council and its funding, that there was a great moment of celebration and joy and jubilation in the council because the pressure was off, it seemed. We finally had reached some stability. And here I was proposing a bold new idea that MRC should transform itself into a much broader base. We should see MRC not as a narrow Ottawa-based agency that delivers grants to people after peer review, but really see it for what it really is. Canada's most treasured social program is its health system. Where is the research foundation that underpins it and supports it and drives the innovation to the health system? I argued at some points that perhaps some of the difficulties the Canadian health system faces is its poorly underfunded research base. If you were running, as is the case today, a $130 billion program, your board of directors would be asking every meeting, how's our research pipeline? What's new? What's going to bail us out? What's the next great prospect? And in many cases, when I was started, deputy ministers of health never even had the subject of health research on the agenda. Can you imagine? And with those thoughts in mind, I had the great good fortune at the time to have a wonderful Minister of Health in Alan Rock, a very supportive, not always fully embraced counsel, but a very supportive counsel. So I took the opportunity to, at our council meeting in March, this was after our cuts had been restored, to brief the minister in the presence of, there you can see Willie Keon, to explain to him that we believe that 1% of the healthcare costs should be devoted to research. Only 1%. You know about all the controversy about 2% defense spending. Well, what greater defense is there for the Canadians who are dying in large numbers than at least spend 1% of the health budget on research? He listened carefully and turned to me, and I hadn't briefed him ahead of time, which is a bit unfair. How much is this going to cost, Henry? Well, I said, sir, it'll be an extra $500 million because our budget's 250, and an extra 5 would take us up to 1%. He thought carefully, and he said, well, Henry, why don't you work hard to try and get it? And he got up and he said that more or less. And this depicts simply the difference of seeing the MRC as a narrowly based agency in Ottawa, sending out some money to isolated, separate places, instead of seeing a health research enterprise that's integral to the health system and integrated into it, driving innovation, supporting it, ensuring that its continuation is at its highest level. And so then we interviewed Joan Bryden of the Ottawa Citizen, and to my horror, the next week on the front page, July 2nd, was this wonderful title, headline, Rockey's $500 million plan to boost medical research. Well, that got my minister's attention, but even more significantly, it got Eddie Goldenberg's attention. And he called me and he said, I think we should have lunch, Henry. And so we went and had lunch, and he said, tell me about this initiative. What is this all about? And the real dividend was not the intervention of Eddie, but was the friendship that began at that time. And throughout my career in Ottawa, there was no one more supportive of many of the things we tried to do than Eddie Goldenberg. And so we continued across the country to explain to any audience that would listen about the purpose and the concept and the value of investing properly in health research. And by October, there's growing even a fragile consensus that the idea had a good deal of merit. And we continued to have discussions with finance and others. And in the budget of 1999, Minister of Finance announced the intention of government to create an interim governing council to develop the greater proposals in detail. And Eric Maldoff and Dorothy Lamont were my vice chairs, and a task for an interim governing council was created with executive director, and they worked very hard, and essentially they wrote the bill that became Bill C-13, which received royal assent in April. The bill really stressed that the transformative change that spoken about earlier, that MRC should move beyond biomedical research. It should really embrace the full spectrum, basic discovery research, of course, clinical research, health services research, and recognize that the social determinants of health are powerful and important and impact health in so many different ways. And the newly transformed CIHR, the newly created CIHR, should embrace all of that. And Alan Bernstein was appointed as its first president. He very efficiently created the programs that had been specified by or suggested by the Interim Governing Council, and with 13 institutes, each of them led by an outstanding individual who had expertise in the field. And here you can see the dividend that accrued to MRC. The first three lines, you can see MRC is in the middle. It's half of NSERC's budget, and then gradually with the introduction of CIHR, both are just over $1 billion. So the net dividend over the last number of years is between $4 and $5 billion accrued to the health research community. The last major topic I'll address is the creation of Genome Canada. While many areas of science were advancing, perhaps none more so than genomics. Canada had a proud record of achievement in genetics, but really was at the margins, looking in at genomics. And many of us spoke to Kevin Lynch, who was the Deputy Minister of Industry Canada, and he in turn recognized its importance and appointed a task force led by Martin Godbout, who became ultimately the first president. The memorandum to cabinet was written by Christine Nymark, and in the pre-budget period, Alex McKenzie and I approached Scott Clark, at the Deputy Minister, who was the Deputy Minister of Finance, to make the case for the importance of funding genomics. As we entered the office area, I was somewhat taken aback when he shouted rather loudly, "Lock the vaults, Friesen is coming." And then we proceeded to make our case. And in the 2000 budget, Genome Canada was created with the support of $160 million. A phone call informed Marc Lepage, who was vice president, that the check was not only in the mail, it was in Industry Canada's office. Would he come up and fetch it? And he rushed up there on Friday afternoon, waiting for the secretaries to get their petty cash, and then signed off for the $160 million check and ran down Spark Street Mall to make sure it got into the pouch at the Royal Bank so it would gather interest for the weekend. And under Martin Godbout's leadership as president, 6 regional genome centers were created, and the mandate to Genome Canada was that Canada should be a world leader, not just a bit player, a world leader broadly in health, environment, agricultural, forestry, fisheries, as well as to address ethical legal issues. The response was extraordinary. We had over $1.5 billion of requests for proposals. What to do? Well, we knew the familiar track. We went to see the deputy minister, and he in turn agreed we should see Eddie Goldenberg. And I went over with Martin Godbout to make our case. Eddie had regrettably and sadly had fractured his leg a few months earlier, and he was still on crutches. And as a physician, the first thing I asked was, "How's your leg doing, Eddie?" And he kind of said, "Well, you have a look." And he rolled down a sock, and I palpated the area, and it was pain-free. And I said, "I think you're going to ski by the end of the season." And he was so delighted with that. But he said, "Now, what are we going to talk about?" And he said, "You know, I don't write checks." And I said, "I'm fully aware of that, but I know very well that you influence people who do write checks." And the next check arrived, $140 million. So Genome Canada in the first 2 years was started with $300 million. And overall, by now, they've invested over $4 billion in genomics in this country. Just think of it. The cost of decoding the human genome was $3 billion. Took 8 years. Today, you could do it in a few days. Cost less than $1,000. And as my travelogue comes to an end, I wish to acknowledge with a profound sense of gratitude and wonderment the rewarding, exhilarating adventures I've experienced in my journey through the untraveled world that lay ahead of me in '58. I agree with the words of Ulysses. I am a part of all that I have met. And in case you haven't seen a check for $140 million, here it is. But I really do want to conclude by saying that I lived through the golden era of research funding, thanks to the Chrétien government. Imagine, all of these programs were new and initiated. They have profoundly affected the science base in this country and the ability of Canadians to compete. It's quite extraordinary. And what made it possible? Well, Mr. Chrétien once said, Canada is not a superpower, but it strives for excellence. And the one area they can strive for excellence is in research. And we must, and we should. And that was part of the motivating force for his decision to create these wonderful programs. And I might add, all of them continue and continue to be funded. So they've built a solid foundation. They've built well. I thank so many of the people who have given me their loyalty and their support. I can't mention them all, but I do want to mention my wife, who's been unfailing in her support and my family and all that I've tried to do. And I conclude, as I often did when I traveled, with the words of Sir Francis Drake, written in 1577. "Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly when losing sight of land." That's really when we see the stars. I urge all of you to look for the stars.